started here with our third panel, the Conceptual Foundations of Hizmet Movement's Approach to Peacebuilding. Our moderator, once again, it's an honor to introduce Dr. Ori Z. Soltis from Georgetown University. He will be moderating this panel today.
Thanks, Jenna. And it is my honor and my pleasure to be moderating anything that has as part of its title, the Conceptual Foundations of, because I love conceptual foundations of anything, and certainly of the Hizmet movement and its peace-building efforts. As you can see, we have three speakers. Our first is Dr. Abdul Karim Bangura, and he is both from Howard University, and also, while that is his first, as it were, affiliation, he's also researcher in residence of Abrahamic Connections and Islamic Peace Studies at the Center for Global Peace in the School of International Service at American University. And you see, I did my running this morning, so I could say all of that in one breath. Dr. Bangura, the floor is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good afternoon. Okay, which one goes there? Which one goes there? Which one goes there? This. Okay, it's not advancing. Okay. Of course, the lament is 15 minutes. It's really not going to do justice to what I have to say, but I have no choice but to give it a try, or else the moderator already warned me, has his time cards. And what you may not see in the brief bios is that I am a Muslim. I served Mass as an altar boy when I was a youth, and I studied Judaism under the great Rabbi Eliotov, who took care of me in Italy after my father was assassinated for political reasons in Australia. So for me, the Abrahamic connections is real. It's my life. That's how I was raised and groomed, and therefore I take it very seriously. And I found the connection between myself and the great man we are honoring with this conference, the same passion that the Abrahamic traditions teach us. And of course, we learn from the Pirkei Ayot that be amongst the students of Aaron, love peace and pursue peace. Love people and bring them close to the Torah. And we learn from the great Bible, the Holy Bible, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. And from the great Holy Quran, we are taught that when you are told not to cause mischief on the land, you must respond, we are but peacemakers. And that is how this man has lived his life. This is what he has taught us. But have we really learned the deep level of this great man? On May 11, 2011, there have been many, many, many awards. Matter of fact, it's listed among the top 10 public thinkers in the world. But this one stood out because the East-West realized or recognized him as a world peacemaker. Not just local or national or state, but in the globe. And so I decided to do just some Google searches. And what I found was 578,000 citations in just 27 seconds when you put his name and the word peacemaking. I also discovered when you talk about his writing, his works, that he has been cited in 107 million. This is strange, man. 365,000 citations of his work. Now, if you do a just casual Google search, you're not going to find that. But fortunately, some of us who are trained in metadata, we can get much deeper by mining data and learn more things that you would just doing your regular Google search. So then one must ask, why am I doing this? Well, a lot of work has been done on him and his work. Unfortunately, there has not been a systematic scientific investigation of his work that comprises thinking about peace building. Given a complex thinker, one discipline is not going to do it. So I decided to mesh both pluridisciplinary methodologies and Islamic thought processes, Islamic philosophy, from where he was operating. In essence, if you just take one discipline to study this man, you're going to miss the mark. It's too complex a thinker, it's too variable a human being and his work for you to capture his essence. So what did I do? I look at previous works. There are many, many works, and I just look at, I cited 4 in the paper, which is available from the great Hizmet people. I looked at the great John L. Esposito and Ihsan Yalmaz. I look at Zeki, Saritopax, and I look at Eileen Epic's work, which I presented in the paper. Great, great works, great scholarship, very thorough case study approaches. But except for John L. Esposito, who couched his work on the theory of pluralism and the concept of civil society, all the rest are just case studies. Now, is that bad? No, it's not. But it does not allow us to get into deep structure thinking of the man. So therefore, I said pluridisciplinary. And pluridisciplinary methodology can be traced back to the great Cheikh Anta Diop, a Muslim scholar from the Senegal. And of course, those who know a little bit about Cheikh Anta Diop know that he was a physicist, a biologist, a historian, a linguist, and of course, is very passionate Egyptology. And what he taught us was that complex thought processes can never be captured by just one methodology, nor one theory, nor one discipline. So therefore, a combination of disciplines allow us to create a symbiosis between thought processes that then can inform those other disciplines. So it's not just a multidisciplinary approach or a cross-disciplinary approach, but something that meshes half man, half animal, half machine, half barley, half tomato, meshed in to get into the deep source of a thought process. And of course, the great Vercoutrer, a French philosopher, helped to advance this methodology. And then we have Anselm from the Caribbean, who has also done a lot of work, and the great Ahmed Winters, who has gone beyond what they started to try to concretize this thing in the field of linguistics. So what are the major questions of this discipline? How can we research indigenous knowledge to allow us to form a general body of global human development, as the great Fethullah Gulen has been doing? How can we research linkages between sources of indigenous knowledge at the centers of learning in our world? How can we research and link the production and needs of communities? How can we help to ensure that science and technology are generated in relevant ways to address problems of the rural communities? And we see that in his projects in Africa and other parts of the world. It's not just somebody who caters to the big cities, the big capitals. We see his work in rural areas. How can our research help to reduce the gap between the elite and those communities? This is his passion. This is his preaching. So we find in this man an hermeneutic thinker which encouraged directed learning and engage with the knowledge, interest, and real-life situations of our universe. What then is this methodology going to comprise? I said, let's look at its linguistic presuppositions. A linguistic presupposition tells us that within any discourse, there are very deep meaning, there are very deep messages that are sent out that we cannot just ferret out by looking at the discourse. We need certain tools that the field of linguistics has given us. It means that we have to tease out the writer's topics, the writers that have topics. So what we teach at the university levels, English 101, English 102, sentential topics can never capture the essence of what the writer is talking about. So that means we have to dig deeper and get to the linguist NN, as we say in linguistic meaning NN. What is the deep structure? What, when I say something, presupposes something else? For example, if I say I'm a political candidate and I say, has my opponent cheated on his wife again? Well, it presupposes that what? My opponent has cheated on his wife before, so he has this nasty habit. So don't vote for him, vote for me. So there are all of these things that we can tease out in language that are usually not evident. And how do we do that? We say we test for a reliability test, constancy under negation, which means the negation of a sentence or a discourse does not change its meaning. It remains intact, and the details are in the paper. We also say there are presupposition and feasibility. When we apply things at a particular context, it changes. I can say one thing, the good old US of where I will not get into trouble. But if I say it in Saudi Arabia, in Israel, or in Ghana, I may get myself into a lot of trouble. How do we contextualize these things? So it means I have to talk to my great Turkish friends at some of the universities to allow me to understand the context in which this great man was writing and what some of these things that have been written in English, translated in English, really mean in the Turkish context. So I cannot just sit in my cubicles and say, okay, this is what this means. It means I have to find help from those who understand the context in which he was writing from. It also means we have to project the projection problem. That is, one thing can mean something here or in another context, but what if we change everything, we turn it upside its head? Does the meaning still remain the same? So we have to not just look at the discourse in its ordinary sense, but we have to play all kinds of games to make sure that what we are saying is really kosher. And then we have to deconstruct the text, because time will not permit to get into more details of these techniques. But if you read the paper, you'll see that. So we then say fractal. I use fractal methodology because everything has patterns. If you go to Turkey, you see there are patterns in their art, in their architecture. Small circles delineating bigger circles and on in the same shape, in the same rhythm. If there are footpaths, you branch from branches upon branches upon branches. Same patterns. So that may look chaotic on first glance, but once you think and you look at them very carefully, you see order within what may appear chaotic. And the paper tells you a little bit more about the history of fractals, how we have been able to use it in the social sciences, the idea of sets in fractals, the idea of self-similarities, scale invariance, but most importantly, with fractal mathematics or fractal methodology is the idea of a power law. Unlike our regular statistics, unlike our regular correlation, regression, We are happy if we just find the relationship between variables. But we pursue the issue or the question a little bit deeper in fractal analysis to say that at one point, can we say that the relationship between one variable and the other is in two dimensions, not just the values themselves? In essence, we want to be able to say that the data has a scale invariant of fractal because fractal data usually follow a power law. So in essence, we want a logarithmic value, not just a value, but at what power does that value of that statistical relationship really explain what it is that we thought we found. And of course, I gave brief description of the 16 texts in which the great man talked about peace building or wrote about peace building. There's no time to go through them. And I talk about the Islamic Center postulates of peace building in his work. And what I came up with was what I've baptized as the Gulen Islamic Center Peace Building Cluster. And this cluster from his work, we see that it begins with Allah, Ramadan, solving racism, interfaith dialogue, Islamic perspective on terrorism, universal mercy, good education, pure path, order, truth, humility, women, neighbors' rights, serenity, all constitute 15 concentric circles that form the great man's peace-building thought process. And here we have it. You will notice very quickly that there is order. That is a state where we can live in harmony and in peace, as opposed to disorder, a state where we can live in complete chaos, where we can live in uncertainty, where we can live in a very muddled or disturbed environment. And we find that in his writings, while he will look at the problem, he will also see the possibilities of human being transcending those problems and then offer solutions on the most recalcitrant problems. So it's not like us scholars. We are very good at throwing out theories. We define a problem and we stay away from it. But this man is really an intellectual, goes beyond the problem, offers solutions, and come up to say, these are our possibilities as a human race. So you will notice that terror, anybody who has harbored, as we do in our media, that Islam is this religion that precipitates terror, is completely out of whack. But it doesn't run away from the problem. He makes it very clear. You see a lot of disorder. Wherever there is terrorism, there's going to be a great deal of disorder. And then counters the Islamic postulates that say, how do we deal with that? Another thing that stands out is the issue of racism. I don't know if it's on this slide or the next, the past one. He is very concerned with the issue of racism. Not only in his work does he know the history, he tells the history of how black folks were brought to the Americas, the sort of wrath they had to deal with, and what still continues, that persists in the treatment of those folks. Is completely abhorred, completely sad about such a situation in a society that has so much good that can do better. And you see that in the distribution of his entries in his work as something he takes very personally and very seriously. And we also see there is no statistical correlation whatsoever, significant statistical correlation between his postulates of order and disorder. Very clear. He believes that human being is capable of creating order in our world if only we are serious and we work very hard together. And then you see the space portrait mapping of his presuppositions. You see from that space mapping something that you can even put a centroid right straight with only two outliers to show that there is neither orderly nor periodic oscillation, not it is a simple random scattering. Their structure, suggesting that the great man's thought process slides through a higher dimensional attractor. Would this higher dimensional attractor correspond to a cognitive structure in the mind of the great thinker? That is a question that all of us have to ponder. Here's the log-log graph after the data has been run in MATLAB. What did I find? I find that there's a fractal dimension of two-dimensionality on the variable of order and disorder, and a binary logistic statistic revealed that the relationship between the two dimensions is not statistically significant at the 0.05 level. In some, Goulen's text typically move from periodic fractal rather than stretching all the way to pure order or disorder. In essence, the results generated after the MATLAB computer lab run suggest that the combination of negative and positive feedback loop that are embedded in Islamic thought processes are very much pregnant in the great man's writings. In conclusion, for the great man, order and disorder are present in our society, in our world. For the great man, that's why I use this picture, sees the future. You know, what we, his students, have to do is work very hard to make sure we create a world where these young folks, where these children, don't have to endure the sort of craziness that we see in the world today. He believes we should continue his message of an integrative worldview, where Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Shintoism, Yoruba religions, no matter what the faith, no matter what your belief system is, we have to recognize that we all come from one creator, that we all come from one source, and that source has to motivate us to create a more peaceful society. And as our great Egyptian ancestors, from whom we can trace the beginning of civilization, taught us in hieroglyphics, no matter what we do, we should always do it Ham Hetepuru. We translate into English in peace always, and I thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Thomas Gage, who is from Humboldt University. He's an emeritus there, and also the author of Goulen's Dialogue on Education, A Caravanserai of Ideas. And the topic which he will take up for us is the Hizmet movement's approach to peace building in comparison to other initiatives around the world. All 6 billion of them, every corner of the world, that each one gets a fractile of a second.
Thank you, Ori. I have changed the title of my talk somewhat, and it is somewhat keyed after Professor Pangia's remarks earlier today about the patience that is perceivable in those participating in the Hizmet movement. So the title of my talk is Listening Loudly, Service that is Listening Loudly, and inspired by Fethullah Gulen and by Robert Frost, who wrote, "That made me hear the wakening birds around, and hear his long scythe whispering to the ground, and feel a kindred spirit to my own, so that henceforth I no more work alone." To serve by listening loudly models how the Hizmet movement responds to the question Kimse Yokmu, and thereby models for the world a unique process of global peace building. This question, as we learned earlier today from Metin Sertinger, the Kimse Yokmu means, is anyone there? Coming from the mouth of a young girl under tons of rubble during the 1999 earthquake. Her plight constituted a need. And that kind of a need that gives rise to many of the Hizmet agencies, managed initially by anonymous Turks who are influenced and inspired by the words of the poet, theologian, and philosopher Fethullah Gulen. The following discussion, I will focus on another one of Hizmet's missions, and that is education, the province that I have spent a half century in. The wisdom revealed in Hizmet's education projects reminds me of the best models of American local schools of the past. In Turkey, Hizmet's work at the community level addresses student and parent needs more effectively than does the heavily bureaucratic, centralized Turkish education ministry of the 1950s. Of late in the United States and in the state and particularly the federal government, unfortunately, there has been an increase of concentration, somewhat like what existed in the 1950s in Turkey, and is responsible for a significant loss of the source of American pride in its schools. Beginning this discussion with passages from Robert Frost's poem, A Tuft of Flowers, warrants some explanation. The situation is of one going to turn the grass after it had been previously mowed before the dew dried in the sun. A curious episode occurs where a butterfly passes by the mower and lights on a tuft of flowers. Quote, "A leaping tongue of bloom the scythe had spared, beside a reedy brook the scythe had bared." This nearly insignificant event leads the speaker, who communes in dialogue with his predecessor, the one who had mowed earlier, to ponder metaphysical questions beyond dialogue and observation, a rumination expressed in the lines, "Men work together, I told him from my heart, whether we work together or apart." Reading deeply in Gulen's writings, like Frost's poem, elicits the wisdom of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who asked, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Gulen asked a similar question of young Turks near Izmir about the time of Kennedy, and has since apostrophed that question to audiences beyond Anatolia, to the Philippines, to Ireland, to South Africa, to the United States. Time-tested excellence as opposed to fashion. You know, George Bernard Shaw quipped that fashion is so ugly, it has to change every 6 months. And for the last quarter century, in the United States, new models of education have kept educators dizzy with the latest brand walking down the catwalk of accountability, a development that contrasts with what and how Hizmet has achieved results in education. Educators who are and have been inspired by Gulen more resemble the wisdom-centered schools of the United States in the 19th century and early 20th century. Then the head of a school district was called the education philosopher, and the one at the local school was called the principal teacher. That was before the titles changed to superintendent, not philosopher of education, and his subordinate, the principal, who in no way was valorized for his ability as a pedagogue, and whose training too often lacked teaching experience beyond coaching and counseling. With these changes in the nomenclature and the function, the school became known as the plant, and the students the product. Now, with increasing federal control, such as No Child Left Behind, the accountability-driven cost-benefit analysis is the primary mission of administrators and principals. This language resonates with militarism and results in miseducation, void of wisdom, with no priority towards peace building. Concomitantly, the schools became plants, and I don't mean roses or grass to be mowed, but plants like factories. And changes occurred in stances. These changes necessarily anonymized the students as the other. These changes antagonized teachers towards administrators. These changes altered teachers' attitudes towards students who are now the source of reward or punishment. And these changes has positioned administrators as accountants desperately trying to cut costs to ramp up school scores. The net result is loss of cohesion at the school site and the community. All these language changes in policy reveal a tectonic shift away from the model of schooling to the model of business. And I would go so far as to say that so many of the models around the world have used the model of business in trying to tackle as NGOs the needs of people who are in need. For Gulen, the physical, social, and intellectual needs of students are the constants. They're the bottom line that educators must attend to in good schools, not profits nor incremental increases in the number of exams that purport to measure heaped on information. The business model imposed upon education has resulted in disappointing results at the macro measurement level. The United States has the highest percentage of incarcerated prisoners. It suffers from maldistribution of wealth and is deficient in the developing of human capital in an information economy of diminishing durational half-lives of facts. And I'll come back to unpack that during the discussion. Accountability-driven cost-benefit analysis results in ever new models imposed on teachers from above before there's even adequate time to measure or assess the effect of that last innovation. The situation reminds me of a farmer in the chicken yard with a bag of corn, takes a handful in the right hand, throws it to the right, and the chickens go galloping over to the right. Takes another handful and throws it to the left, and the chickens go running over to the left. And back and forth go the chickens and those involved in their teaching without ingesting educational nutriments. What's needed is an instantiation of I-thou attuning, which I say is typical of what I see and have observed in Hizmet agencies. An I-thou attuning rather than an I-it objectification. Students in local schools today around the United States are faced with intrusive I-it demands, which, with effects that erode wisdom learning, basic to peace building. Teachers, to keep pace with bureaucratic demands, are deaf and blind often to those seated before them. Wisdom learning occurs best from the stance of the I-thou encounters. To complement Gulen's message of garnishing wisdom, listening loudly to a tune is to appreciate how learning is best acquired permanently. And I'd like to take, and I think of this particular stance can be observed by entering classrooms and even observed at the sentential level where you hear a teacher saying yes and as opposed to yes but. This is the stance that we need to encourage. And let me take two examples of Hizmet projects. The first one, the Hizmet work in Mardin, Turkey. This is a very contentious area bordering Turkey and Syria, where I did my Fulbright in Aleppo. It's centered at Atak College School, and the curriculum fulfills national requirements, and many of its graduates go on to major universities around Turkey. But the education staff also addresses the unique needs of the locality. And these are one of the distinguishable features of the Hizmet movement, is the locality from which the need occurs. As reported in the research of Mehmet Koloncu, formerly of the Walsh School here at Georgetown, Attackology in the 2000s provided academic preparation with equal mastery in social and academic achievement. It hosted a number of clubs that addressed the needs of the local community, and then at the end of the year had a festival where all of the participating adults came, and they were required to vote for that particular club that addressed the need which that person felt was the purpose of education. This is an incredible achievement, and since the 2000s, 150 villages around that region have been brought in, hived into that centripetal experience. The second example I'd like to mention is the youth platform of the Gulen Institute at Houston, University of Houston. My colleague, Don Koj, is the director of it. And since 2000, students from all around the world have been writing essays which have been evaluated, and the winners have been brought to Washington, D.C., each with a chaperone. To date, over 100 students from around the world, from the Maldives, from France, from Burkina Faso, from Bosnia-Herzegovina, Canada, the United States, Italy, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Papua New Guinea. Students from these countries come to Washington, D.C. for 4 days where they have a tour of the city, and it culminates in an award assembly at Congress, in the Rayburn Building of Congress. Those winners receive awards and certificate of merits from congresspersons and from ambassadors or representatives from their offices. This has been a remarkable achievement where, to exemplify the I-thou experience, if you are there at Dulles when these students come in from around the world, it's already an I-thou experience. One student will say to another, "Oh, you're from Herzegovina, and you have a cat named Kitten." And in other words, on Facebook, these students have created this community, and they are not experiencing people for the first time, as we were this morning. They were having a reunion. And that reunion is the I-thou stance that we need to recapture in American education. To conclude, I'd like to, I'd like to just mention back at the poem by Frost, in which he concludes a rather interesting wisdom lesson in A Turf of Flowers. He first says, "Men work together, I told him from my heart, whether we work together or apart." The concluding line is, "Men work together, I told him, from my heart." This is an I-thou as opposed to an I-it kind of stance that you have at the beginning of the poem that solidifies the sense of community of us. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And those students will be visiting Georgetown this spring, won't they? Yes, they will, the winners, the 30 of them. Our third speaker this afternoon is Kajit Bagu, who is a third-year PhD student of the School of Law at the University of Edinburgh, whose research focuses on using appropriate constitutional designs to facilitate effective peace-building in multi-identity societies from a cognitive justice theoretical perspective, and that's the perspective, or the prism rather, through which he will be looking at Gulen optimism toward peace-building in pluralist dialogue.
What is this thing called peace building? One of the things I learned at the University of Warwick in my classes on the theories and histories of human rights is the difference between concepts and conceptions. A concept is an idea which could have different conceptions. So, the particular way in which a concept is articulated by any person or group or ideology is a conception. The concept of peace building I intend to look at from an analytical comparative perspective, primarily against what I call the cognitive justice peace building perspective. It's a summary of my paper, which is divided into two main parts and 6 sections. The first part is about Golan optimism towards pluralism and dialogue. And the second part brings in the cognitive justice comparative perspective. The 6 sections give you a background, and then focusing on the Golan optimism itself, then cognitive justice and pluralism. Then we move on to cognitive justice and Golan optimism, the comparative bit. Then Golan in global peace building, and finally, a little critique, in my opinion, of the Golan approach to peace building. So, the concept of peace building became topical with the decline of the Cold War dichotomy. And I'm sure for those who have engaged a bit with peace studies will be aware that Johan Galtung is known as the father of peace studies. So with the decline of this bipolar conflict paradigm, internal conflicts within nation states came to the fore of discourse. And these were centered on identity dichotomies within the construct of the nation state, a construct that is highly problematized because of its descent from the empire worldview and from the Westphalian construct of the state, the nation state. Because in truth, you have many nations and subnational groups comprised within a state. And the quest for homogenizing identity is not a smooth ride. It often leads to conflict. So with mass atrocities, in law, mass atrocities is a term used to refer to four things: genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Particularly with what happened in Rwanda and the Balkans, attention shifted to what to do with this. And different people theorized. Huntington talked about the clash of civilizations to explain the trajectory of conflict after the supposed triumph of capitalism over socialism. And so in 1992, Boutros Ghali, the then Secretary General of the UN, came up with the concept of peace building. And he defined his own conception of peace building, which has become the UN conception of peace building to date, as action to identify and support structures which will tend to strengthen and solidify peace in order to avoid a relapse into conflict. That, therefore, gives a limitation, a delimitation to this conception of peace building. And since then, the UN has stuck to this conception of peace building, which becomes increasingly narrow in the context of the advancements made in peace-building studies. New conceptions of peace-building have come up, and Hizmet, Golan optimism, is one such conception. If you go to the Peacebuilding Commission website, which was the Peacebuilding Commission was established in 2005, pursuant to several studies sponsored by the United Nations, the prominent one of which is the Brahimi report of 2000 and subsequent reports. You find there are only 6 countries on the Peacebuilding Commission's agenda, and they're all African: Burundi, Sierra Leone, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Central African Republic. So there has been a restrictive conception of peacebuilding for the United Nations, except for what the new doctrine of responsibility to protect, which tended to broaden the spectrum of peace building by looking at human protection. First of all, the responsibility of states to protect their people, and where they fail, the responsibility of the international community. But even this norm has arguably been discredited. I argue in one of my papers that the recent way in which it was employed in Libya has lent it to discredit. Now, Golan optimism is a conception of peace building that is broader than the UN conception. And that is what makes it to have projects, action in many countries, 100 and over 100 countries. Why? Because it defines peace building as education. I'm using what is on the website: education, interfaith and intrafaith dialogue, advocacy, conflict resolution, and peace education, which can create trust and cooperation over ethnic, religious, and other divisions. I would argue that this broader conception of peace building makes more resonates more with the realities of conflicts that the world faces, beyond just the 6 countries of the UN Peace Building Commission. How is the Golan perspective conception of peace building optimistic, as described by Esposito and Yilmaz? It is optimistic precisely because it springs from a surrounding of pessimism. And so, borrowing from Professor Mohammed Abu Nima's analysis of approaches to conflict studies in Islam, I came up with 3 approaches to pluralism. And the core thing here is the reality of diversity, of pluralism. Well, it is a reality. The question is, what do we do with it? And so we have 3 approaches, in my opinion. Absolute intolerance of pluralism in Islam. Partial tolerance, which can be subdivided into pessimistic partial tolerance and optimistic partial tolerance, and then tolerance of pluralism. In the first category, absolute intolerance, are those people who adopt interpretations of the Sunnah, the Hadith, the texts, that are absolutely exclusionary. And this pattern has been referred to several times today. And particular concepts within Islam that are used to promote this interpretation include jihad, dar al-harb, territory under war, according to some restrictive interpretations, the concept of the dhimmi, the second-class citizen, for them, the full Muslim, the full human is one who is a male, Muslim, believing, upright. The concept of ridda is apostasy under Islamic law. Those who hold on to the rigid interpretation that anyone who professes la ilaha illallah and recants and leaves a religion should be incarcerated, fed on bread and water for some days. If he doesn't repent, then he's killed. Narrow interpretations of that would incline one to categorize such into the absolute intolerant category. Those that adopt partial tolerance begin from the premise of the Medina Charter between Jews and those who believed in Medina. But then, the disposition of any person would make one either optimistic or pessimistic. Amongst the pessimistic group are those who would adopt exclusionary perspectives. The optimistic ones are those who realize that diversity, pluralism, is something that you cannot do without. You do away with. You just have to find a way of getting around it. And so I came up with 5 principles of the Golan optimism that makes it stand out from the others, which include recognition of the peculiarity of conflict and peace building for every era. And for the modern times, a distinction is made: contextualization. Then the core values are prioritized over the exclusionary tendencies, and tolerance emanates from this, and then leads to mutual understanding and dialogue, and an active engagement in preemptive, preventive, broadly conceived notion of peace building. Now, what is cognitive justice? It's a concept first used by Professor Shiv Viswanathan in 1997 to refer to the right for different knowledges to be treated equally. The right to equal treatment of difference. So long as an identity, a knowledge, a people are different, they have a right to be treated equally with any other, irrespective of the content of what their worldview might be. This concept was developed by other researchers like Professor Boaventura de Souza Santos. And I have identified 3 principles. First, recognition of diversity of identities. Second, intercultural translation. You encourage an interaction between different groups on the basis of mutuality. And finally, plurality of paths to problem solving, so no absolutist approaches that shut out options. Now, cognitive justice has an interesting history, which you will see in the paper for those who read it, from the colonial heritage of declaring entire peoples, their territories terra nullius, non-existent, we can just acquire, or anima nullius, they have no souls. There was a time when the perception in Europe was that non-European peoples did not have souls. So there's this incidence of conditional baptism. If you have a soul, then I baptize you. And the whole theorization generated and promoted by people like Darwin, the origin of species, and the descent of man, where he sort of entrenched this idea that mutual annihilation of peoples who are different is inevitable, sort of fed into the development of international law over the past few years. These are the kind of the conceptual assumptions that are challenged by the concept of cognitive justice. Now, between cognitive justice and Golan optimism, I've identified a few differences. First, Golan optimism is faith-based and inspired. Cognitive justice arises from the realities of diversities in the global south, the colonized world particularly, and how to redress the entrenched, systematized discrimination and subhumanization of these identities. Secondly, Golan optimism adopts what you call the soft approach, I would say, social capital. Cognitive justice, according to my propositions, tries to bring up institutional, systematic reforms that would entrench the recognition of equality and the reinvestment of humanity with dignity. And thirdly, pluralism, the approach to pluralism, Golan optimism adopts the language of tolerance, which for cognitive justice is a bit weak. Cognitive justice enthusiastically promotes the idea of recognition on equal basis. So, one is not at pains trying to recognize, but begins from the perspective that all are equal. And then Golan is obviously very broad, with tentacles across the world. Cognitive justice is a rising ideology, and it has inspired the idea of a plurinational state, a plurinational society, unlike the nation state. 2 states have passed constitutions in South America, the plurinational state of Bolivia and Ecuador, on the basis of recognition of these identities and diversity, and is a way forward. The differences, the similarities between Golan and cognitive justice, first, they have broader views or conceptions of peace building. Secondly, they promote dialogue for Golan, intercultural translation for cognitive justice, and their approach to pluralism, inclusivist for Golan and recognitory for cognitive justice. In the global context, Golan optimism is involved, in a contest for the soul of Islam. And the outcome of this contest will determine how much impact the Hizmet movement can make in global peace building. And I put this picture because the Hindu religion and the Buddhist religion are not amongst the people of the book in Islam. So it's easier to tolerate the Jews and the Christians than it is to do others. But promoting dialogue in this way, so that otherness, however radically different it might be, is recognized, is a very huge step forward. Now, there's the pessimistic negative signs around, yes. And these people may constitute a very small percentage of Islam, but their impact, the kind of volume, the way they occupy the space in a way that obscures the larger population of Muslims is something that cannot be underestimated. On the other hand, there are also optimistic signs around the world. An article written by Asani in 2003, So That You May Know Each Other, An American's Perspective to Pluralism, shows signs of progress. My critique of the Golden approach, my skepticism, are possible limitations that the Hizmet approach might have. First, it doesn't really articulate a political theory of how the state should be structured, what the law should be, what the constitution should be in reflecting pluralism. Secondly, I find it difficult to make out what the Hizmet attitude, a Muslim who is a Hizmet person, what his ideas would be about Ridda, apostasy, Dhimmi, the second-class person, and jizya, payment of tax, protection money because you are not a Muslim. Now, in the absence of direct Hizmet propositions of what the state should be, what the law should be, I think these are areas that Golan thinkers should look at. Someone like Abdullahi An-Naim, I don't know if he's a Hizmet person, but he has ideas, and he says certain things need to be reformed to come to terms with the modern times. So, finally, we have seen the rise of the concept of peace building and the different conceptions that have emerged. The Golan conception and how it is broader, the competing Muslim visions of pluralism, and how Golan stands out, a glimmer of hope. I've discovered Golan because of the word peace building, which is the core of my research. I come from a country where there are diverse identities, 250, more than 250. And how do you manage this? So, Golan is like a light, a blast from the blues for me. We've seen how it compares with cognitive justice. We've seen the global impact. But I still argue that if Hizmet worldview of Islam can be spread, maybe have 1 billion more people in the world, it will have very huge impact. And we've seen the possible limitations. Thank you.
You probably all noticed, but just in case you didn't, I'll point it out, that what links these three talks is actually not concept, although it does, but language, words. That we started out with Dr. Bangura talking about words like fractal thinking, words like pluridisciplinary, and the relationship between cosmos and chaos, or order and disorder, problems, solutions, possibilities. It was about words, and of course, Dr. Gage then turned to words by way of Robert Frost, and by way of Robert Frost to Martin Buber, although you didn't mention the old boy's name, 1923 work, I and Thou, but he talked about, I'm sure it's in the paper, I-thou relationship, I-it experience, and teased that out, coming to the conclusion of Frost's conclusion, how his beginning of the poem is different from the end of the poem so subtly by a word, by language, in terms of its underlying meaning. And of course, what prompts Frost, as he points out, is, after all, a tuft of flowers, that is to say, the most modest and humble piece of our reality, which I think Gulen would appreciate as a panhenotheist who finds the one God in everything, that Frost found the God of relationship in a tuft of flowers. And we ended up, of course, with Kajit Bagu's starting out by distinguishing concept from conception and ending up by talking about optimism and pessimism in the context of a whole array of important words in Arabic that are at the heart of Islam and that are constantly subject to vision and revision. That's another pair of words, I think. So I open this up now to questions of our questioners. We'll see whether they can answer our questions, they who question so much. We have about 22 minutes to be sort of precise. And is there a question from the audience? Yes. Do we have, or is the mic going around, or do you want people to come to the mic?
This is what we're going to do. We have a standing mic here. So folks on this side of the room, if you have a question, please come to the mic, and we'll go to that. We'll just do it to change the
Okay.
wireless mic on that side as well. This will help with
Sounds good.
our friends.
So you are the first. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first.
I just have a small observation to the last speaker, really, suggesting that Hizmet should probably contribute to the discourse on reader, apostasy, and things like that. And I think it's not going to be in the interest of the movement once it goes to political and theological issues. So it will set it up sort of against the more Islamist groups. So I think it's better it is kept the way it's been developing the human capital and sort of the altruistic styles of this. So, and that's just my
And
observation.
your comment ties in a way with the comment that was made earlier during the second panel regarding the first speaker's talk in the second panel regarding things that the Hizmet movement could think about, and whether they should think about it or not, because it might not be so good to put emphasis on it, right? I don't know if you want to respond to that or just nod your head one way or the other, Kajid.
Well, one other thing is there are so many Muslims that stand by. And whoever takes the center stage might just win them. I don't think the extremists avoid contentious issues. I don't think the pessimists avoid contentious issues. So it's up to the optimists, like Golan, to see how they can counter that. If it's by silence.
And Gulen himself speaks out, doesn't he, every time something happens?
Yeah, I mean a vision of the state, a vision of the constitution. For the extremists, for the pessimists, it's a Sharia state. I'll give an example with Boko Haram. I mean, it affects Islam intra and inter. If you are a Muslim and you don't subscribe to their view, your sentence is death. And if you are a non-Muslim, then automatically killing you is a holy thing. So they want to impose a state on the whole world for them. They are actively working towards that. Well, the other ones, the social capital approach is saying, okay, promote schools, give healthcare. They're saying nothing about what the law, what the state should be. Someone like Abdullahi An-Naim has spoken. I know it's going to be a bit difficult, but ultimately it's the system, the structure that plays a very great role in shaping what comes to be reality and what remains aspiration.
So another, in the back.
Thank you. Elshad Masterov from Moscow, Russia. My question is to Kajid Bago. A dialogue and a mutual understanding require common ground, but representatives of different cultures have an understanding of the dialogue adopted in their cultures, in their own religious tradition. My question is simply, how can people from diverse cultures find common ground for dialogue?
Thank you. How can people from diverse cultures find common ground when members of each group are locked in and probably have constructed an out-group image of enemy neighbors? How? And this is where social structure and the concepts that underlie the structuring of society comes in. And that is why also in my research I have problematized the concept of the nation state. African states, being unnatural, will continue to be unstable because they were constructed hegemonically and not counter-hegemonically. The homogeneous idea of the citizen is a pipe dream. It's not a reality. And that's why I'm happy Nigeria has called for a national conference to discuss the future. Let the people speak. But before you allow the people to engage among themselves, there are frameworks for regulating this in a manner that creates positive discourse. And I'll talk about the plurinational constitutional design, where you're talking of many nations coming together in one state, not the nation state. The nation state, in a way, is a convenient cover for one identity to probably exterminate the others. Well, it's just a nation state. You made reference to Turkey. You can't mention the Kurdish people. But when you acknowledge the fact that, look, this is the diverse society, a pluralist society, and you construct the legal structures, the institutional designs, the cartography, and the epistemology based on that, from that perspective, then you are able to regulate the frontiers of intercultural translation. You officially adopt plurinational values. I think that is one new model. Anyway, it's not very well known, but research, cognitive justice, like I said, came up in 1997. The plurinational constitutional design only came into force in 2008, 2009 in Ecuador and Bolivia, two countries that had instability until these constitutions came into being, and to date, they are quite stable. So from there, researchers have a duty to begin to re-examine the concept of the nation state. Even the United Kingdom, the old empire, has undergone devolution. 1998, there was devolution to Scotland, to Wales, and to Northern Ireland. Now, next year, Scotland is going to have a referendum on independence. The nation-state construct is highly problematized. You see the works of researchers like Michael Keating, Professor Tierney, James Tolley from Canada, who looks at Canada has similar issues. So that is a model that could inspire the future organization of society that has many identities. For now, there is a poverty of ideas about how to deal with pluralism, and we're stuck with the nation-state for now. So we look forward to progress. That's what I would say.
Dr. Gage, you were going to answer?
A couple of thoughts. One, talking about the situation in Nigeria, which the panel earlier touched upon. Several years ago, I started a project, and it's still going, but I'm not running it, where we had a classroom here in the United States with a classroom abroad. And we had 30 different schools around the world. Bali, Indonesia was linked with Willits, California. Eureka High School was linked with Kwerna Secondary School in Luxor, Egypt. And we actually had a linkage with, between Rainbow Academy in Reno, Nevada, and a school in Yobe in northern Nigeria. It's the Nigerian Turkish International College. Now, this was back in 2007, and I've witnessed essentially how the development of the Boko Haram has surfaced and what that teacher, that school must be living in fear of. I think this is one of the things that we really have to appreciate about the Hizmet movement. Gulen uses the word action insan, people of action, and the courage with which these teachers have gone to these parts of the world to establish relations is quintessential, that Buberian notion of the I-thou. I'd also like to pick up on what you were just talking about in terms of the nation state. That nation state creates an epistemological frame within our minds so that we approach each nation as if they are a glass and we have a straw. And we try to suck up the information of that particular glass. Take the Syrian situation. If you look at that Syrian situation, then you are, and you're only focusing down on Syria, you're forgetting that the Alawi community of which Assad family belongs to extends all the way up into the Iskandarun, which was previously Syria when I was born. So we have an incredible mixed bag, and I think the way we are coming at a lot of these problems, I so agree with you, is limited by that kind of conceptual frame that the press picks up, and all of a sudden we become instant authorities about Syria or about Bolivia. And I think we have to really break free and approach things in regional patterns, in fractals.
And that's in fractals. And that's, of course, one of the things about the Hizmet movement that we have on and off already been talking about and surely will continue to. Education, which starts with very little children and continues all the way up, and for which the schools and the programs have nothing per se to do with the particular shape of the nation state. So both of those issues, starting when they're young and building up, shaping that sense of mutual tolerance is too weak a word, but mutual respect and acceptance of cognitive justice principle that has nothing to do with the shaping of the state, right? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hey, my name is Peacebuilding from Rethink Institute, Washington. I will address my question to Mr. Bagutu because he kind of opened the Pandora's box here, I guess. So with all due respect to other panelists, they can join though. So about the lack of political philosophy in Hizmet, this is one of the frequently asserted criticism, actually, and usually it comes from political philosophers because they want to see some material and they can't find it. But then I think in terms of, when you really conceptualize political philosophy, I think with the 5 principles that you explained here very well, that's the political philosophy of Hizmet if you want to have one. And in that sense, you may not have explicit corresponding institutions for those principles. But then I think Hizmet's philosophy is to reconcile people who belong to different political philosophies and let them talk with each other and reconcile their differences. I think that's in itself is a political philosophy. You can, I don't know, is it like ultra-liberal, whatever you can call it. So that's one thing. Second, in terms of specifying a certain constitution, state, and law system, and vis-a-vis, what's happening in the Muslim world with the extremism and radicalism, actually, if you look at the source and root cause of these radicalism, they are radical because they are specifying a constitution, law, and state system, okay? And that is, they want to repeat whatever they understand from the 7th century on, and they want to basically superimpose on the modern circumstances. And because they specify, and they are so hard on it, that we call them extremists and radicals, okay? Sometimes it is probably better not to specify anything, okay? And the fact that Hizmet operates in 150 countries or so, with probably 100 various regimes, okay? I think that probably validates the argument that, it is more important to bring people who would write the constitutions in the future or so together and make them understand each other. And I think this is in itself is a strong political philosophy.
Just a comment. It's dangerous to specify when your worldview is narrow and focused on the homogeneous idea of identity. But when you want to specify basic rules of respecting pluralism, I don't think it's dangerous to say, for example, that everyone should be recognized and the state should have a pluriversal worldview. You are not imposing one narrow view on everyone. It's a vision of the state and the constitution, like I said, that is new. So it's difficult for people to understand how you can legislate pluralism into, the system. You systematize pluralism. You are not imposing one view. Everyone must be this, must speak this language. You recognize people's territorial claims, language rights, sense of autonomy, and cultural heritage. And you constitutionalize these. Then you create common grounds for a pluricultural society. I think that's the core that I would use to qualify what you are saying. For example, if the Hizmet movement should say, okay, the constitution of Turkey, everyone is Turkic. That's a narrow view, and that's why the Kurdish people will feel excluded. That's why the Scottish people feel that whenever you go out and you mention United Kingdom, it's only English that you know. They are fighting for their identity. A pluralist view of the state and the constitution immediately lets you know that this state is not just one nation, but many nations. So just that comment.
Please.
I applaud my colleague who just made a great commentary. I think there is really a political philosophy from the great Gulen. And if we do a deeper reading of what he refers to as universal mercy, and he makes it very clear that the requirement for attainment of justice, not only among Muslims, but between Muslims and non-Muslims as well, for making judgments, then we have to take into consideration emotions, principles, and other tenets of justice as laid out in the books. So it's not that there is not a political philosophy, but Gulen does not come and superimpose his own perspective of how constitution should run, how states should run. And when you're dealing with multiplicity of cultures and peoples, it becomes very dangerous. So therefore, I agree with the first commentator. We have to be careful as scholars not to also conflate levels of analysis. When we talk about the nation state, and they will talk about Boko Haram, we are now conflicting levels of analysis, just like J. David Singer told us in international relations, the problem of levels of analysis in international relations. Boko Haram, I will not even classify it as a religious organization. It is very political in its approach, in its extent. Just because somebody used the word Muslim does not legitimize its actions as Islamic. We saw that in 9/11, where a group of people decided to do something, quote, in the name of Islam. Well, the first people that died in 9/11 were Muslims. Those traders at the bottom of those buildings who came from Guinea, Israel, and other countries that are there very early in the morning. When those things came tumbling down, it did not discriminate. Matter of fact, if you look at the list on the website, you find out that over 100 people that died have Muslim names. So one cannot, we have to be very careful when we make these analogies. And we now know from evidence that even Boko Haram has connections all the way to the president's office. So one has to be we have to be very careful when we make these analogies. And my last point, and the wonderful gentleman talked about how do we create relationships, how do we dialogue, how do we get along. One thing we can say, and this is something those of us who travel back and forth to the Middle East and Africa say, is that Muslims in African society, Middle Eastern society, can learn a lot from Muslims in the United States. In the sense that when 9/11 happened, it was like a blessing in disguise. All of a sudden, we have very excellent interfaith dialogues all over the country that have promoted good relationships in this country between Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Christians, and others. And we also have to be very careful, just because Islam emphasizes people of the book. If you read my book on Islam and contemporary society, Islam also talks about the good things of Hinduism. It also talks about other religions, the good aspects. And the Quran does not shy away where the differences lie. So we have to be very careful when we throw this broad statement. A more careful reading is warranted. So Islam just, yes, it talks about the people of the book, but it also does deal with other religions, emphasize the strength, the goodness of those religions, and also highlights where the differences are with Islam. And that is a point we should always take into consideration. So what we have learned in the United States about building relationship between Muslims and other folks of other faiths is that it's a lot easier to have interfaith dialogue than it is with intra-faith dialogue. So if we want to create that community, we want to create that commonality, we have to begin within our own groups and get an understanding. That way we are much more organized, we are much more clear how to deal with other people. I think that's where the thing should begin. Thank you.
We have time for one more question, maybe two, depending upon how fast the question, how fast the answers.
Hello, my name is Tariq Najil. I'm a graduate student at Georgetown studying Islam and Muslim Christian relations. So my question has to do with that. And it is how, if when we're studying peace building, we're taught to stay away from hot button issues. And it seems the success of the Hizmet movement and other movements in peace building is staying away from those issues and being altruistic or dealing with human service. And when you connect on a human level, then we're able to break down those barriers and respect one another. So what would your suggestion be when entering the world of politics, where many of the issues that you're discussing are political issues or issues that are much more complex than a service level? What can we take from the Hizmet movement in your studies that we can use on that political level to help us have political discourse or peace building? Thank you.
Dr. Gage, everyone seems to be pointing at you.
Well, you avoid politics. You know, one of the problems is, this is a very interesting coincidence, because this last weekend I was at a conference at Asilomar, an organization that is now in the 62nd year of organizing programs, and my colleague, as a matter of fact, he was the best man at my wedding, is very political. And he has been, as a result of last weekend, very interested in essentially trying to get the various universities that have campuses in China to withdraw campuses. Now, I was thinking, you know, one of the problems with Professor Myers' approach to things is how helpful is that if you're teaching in Nanning, China, and Guangxi province, and you're developing these I-thou relationships, you have connections, you're developing an infrastructure that could ramify through for another 2 decades. How helpful is it when all of a sudden issues become so polarized that you create a situation where, you know, we go back to before Nixon went to China. You know, I think the political approach is extremely limited and hermeneutic. I mean, it's insular in its approach. I believe the United Nations is an incredible organization. I think that the Alliance for Civilizations, if you're not familiar with this, check it out on the web. The Alliance for Civilization addresses youth, media, tourism, and one more. This particular approach is political because it's from the United Nations. But I really side with Sajid. I think we have to start thinking about something that's supranational and regional in addressing problems. Politics is just, in my 50 years of teaching, we spend an awful lot of time trying to ring bells in Washington, D.C., while the entire state or county changes nature and we have a broken Congress. I mean, I don't have much faith in politics.
Yes, please.
If I may add, I think Muallim Gulen is correct. It talks about universal education and what he calls good education. And he says it's a right, even an obligation, especially in Islam, which we refer to haq al-ilm. And he also says the right leads to invention and greater production. And he says for Muslims, tarbiyah, which is education in Arabic, transcends just pedagogy. And that's what we've been doing. We spend a lot of time in our programs teaching pedagogy. But we've never emphasized how do we live for our connections with the Almighty. And I think in this, Islam has something to offer very seriously in how we communicate and transcend the issues my brother raised from Georgetown. So it then means that the sort of education we should engage in is what the Quran already teaches. For me to be a good Muslim, it means I have to be a good Jew. It also means I have to be a good Christian. That means what? If you go to my office, I have my Bible, my Torah, and my Quran. Forget my background, okay? You go to my house, at the desk right to my bed, it's my Quran, my Hadith, my Bible, and my Torah. We have to be open-minded to read other things. We Christians cannot just read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, if I don't finish them. It means, just like Gulen says, we have to find places of serenity to read more, especially you are in a program that you have to read more because you have to be the messenger after your education at Georgetown to go teach these things, to go preach these things, and get people to live real, what Gulen calls the good education. Not just the one that gives us the diploma, the degree, and then we blast it around to say we're educated. So the education has to change. Matter of fact, out of the former realms, it means not be afraid to talk to people about the goodness of all these other religions, even when they don't want to listen. And that, I think, is our number one task.
On which note, will you join me in, I'm sorry, we really don't. We're already over time. If you would join me in thanking our three panelists. And